Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on Tuesday, the 24th of January 2023. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on tonight, and thanks very much for taking out some time of your Tuesday evening to join us. It really is great to have you on the show with us. And I've got Robbie, I'll bring him in just a second. Very important conversation tonight, specifically about the future of Australia and the financial system and how it actually interacts, and some of the things that we should be thinking about. Before I do that, I will just remind you, as normal, that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. Please play nice in the chat room. No racial slurs, please. We do moderate the stream, but we also encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat, and the more the chat, the merrier. This is as the 24th of January. If you're watching in replay, use that Walk the World if you want to get my attention. That means that your question gets, or your comment gets, into my queue. And if you want to ask a question, of course, use that Walk the World. I also enable Super Chat, which means that you can get your question to the top of the list and indeed make a contribution to what we do here, which is always greatly appreciated. Anyhow, let me now bring Robbie in. Robbie, hello.
Hello, Martin. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, and thank you very much for coming on tonight and spending some time with us. This is a really, really important conversation, and timing, of course, is pretty good because within a couple of weeks, Parliament will be back, and we've been upping the ante over the last couple of months, specifically around this question of retail branch closures and how to actually get the banking system to work for us rather than against us.
Yeah, for sure. Partly my timing was to wait a week until the dust settled from last week. Let all the fur that was flying settle down. Now we can focus on something we can all collaborate on, I would hope, rather than fight about. And that is, this question of, do you allow the banks to be an oligopoly, a cartel? And if you allow the banks to be an oligopoly, do you allow them to dictate to customers instead of serving customers, regardless of the consequences? Because that's what's happening in Australia now. But I think I want to appeal to your audience, Martin. Take the time to pinch yourself and see where we've come in a short period of time in talking about this. Right? So a lot of I know, going by the live discussion, you got a lot of regulars, and I'm asking the regulars, Cookie Boy and all the rest of them, think back to when you and I first started talking about this specific issue of regional branches on your show sometime in the last, year or so, right? Well, what we're now starting to see is a dramatic acceleration in awareness. There's a lot of attention now being drawn to this, and I can tell you, it was our efforts that generated the awareness, right? We started, and it always starts off slow, and then you get past that initial inertia, and then it goes with a whoosh, and we're in that whoosh period now. People are looking at this all over the place, and I think we can build on that to achieve something very concrete in 2 weeks' time, which is a proper inquiry. People are going to get sick of me talking about inquiries on your show, but this is an inquiry into not just any inquiry into the banks is good. And this is also an inquiry into the bank's processes and how they were able to rig the last inquiry, which they call the Regional Banking Task Force. So if we get that up, I know the senators on the committee that you wrote to and Dale Webster co-wrote to, asking for an inquiry, they actually want to look at this. They are motivated to look at this. We just have to persuade the Senate to do it. To vote for it. And so from tonight's discussion, we want people to be making phone calls over the next 2 weeks before Parliament comes back to do that. But if we get that up, that can be used straight away to send a message to banks that are about to cut off 26 towns around Australia from banking services in the next few months that are on the chop, that are on death row now, right? And this says to the banks, we're watching you. What you're about to do will be scrutinised by the Parliament, right? And that's pressure that they're not going to want to like. So that's what we want to come out of tonight as we discuss all this through.
Absolutely, Robbie. And I think it's worth just contextualising this slightly, because we shouldn't be talking just about regional banking in isolation from the broader question of how do we get the finance system to support Australia and Australians, rather than at the moment where effectively, frankly, Australians are paying through the nose for services and the banks just walk away with it, right? There's something fundamentally wrong with the way the banking system is designed and built, and who's leading and who's following. And just one illustration of that more broadly, if you think about mortgage lending, right? We've now got twice as much mortgage lending relative to business lending. Go back a generation, it was precisely the other way around. So banks are not actually supporting the broader investment in things that businesses need across the economy, right? That's one example. Another one, of course, is they tried to go through one way to remove cash out of the system, and they failed on that because we resisted them. And they're now going through another route to essentially say, oh, no, you don't need cash anymore. Digital's everywhere. Everybody can use digital. Nothing to see here. Now, there's an agenda here that is bigger than just closing branches and removing services from regional Australia, right? This is about catching people within the banking system, locking them in the banking system, clipping the ticket on the way through, and making sure that they have huge amounts of revenue into the future, and consumers and businesses have no choice but to dance the tune that they're actually setting. And that's the context for this, right? So effectively, we have to turn this around and say, no. Banks are there to serve. Banks are not there to lead.
Yeah, exactly. Well, can I share my screen? I want to start off by showing the audience some of the coverage that's been generated over the last month or so.
Yep. Is that the screen that you're ready to show now?
I'll do this one first.
Yep. Once it's loaded, I'll switch it across.
Oh, what's happened to it? Come on.
Loading.
Come on, bloody internet.
There you go.
Irony. My internet's so slow I couldn't load a picture of a bank, let alone do online banking.
And you're not out in the sticks.
That's right. I'm 10 kilometres from the CBD in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was end of November last year, and Martin and I have been working closely with this town, Coober to save its last bank. Now, that bank there is slated to shut on the 13th of February. That bank is the next bank on the chopping block. And it's not the last bank in town, it's the only bank in town. Now, that tells you straight away something different than other places, Martin. You often say, what's your saying? It's no bank wants to be the last bank in town. Coober has only ever been served by one bank because it's a special case.
Yep.
So this is not about Westpac saying, oh man, we just can't support this operation anymore. This is about Westpac pushing some other agenda.
It's ideological.
Right? Exactly. Coober has fallen foul of their digital agenda. But this one, the media could see that this had to be covered. This is a good article in ABC. They covered the fact that Senator Rennick, who you had on the show last week, actually raised this town in Parliament. They covered our campaign for a postal bank, right, to actually be the solution to this, and we can talk about that more later. And then they go through some of the important specifics there. So that was in late November. Then the next one I want to switch to. This happened. This was ABC 7:30 on the 19th of December. Video: Australian towns are fighting to hold on to their local bank branches. And this came about because, again, for the benefit of the audience, Martin and I have been working with the town of Junee, who want to fight to save their last bank, which is a Commonwealth Bank. And they should have been, their execution was supposed to be in the second week of December, but they were able to get a stay of execution because they told the Commonwealth Bank, well, you're leaving town, you're telling us to use the post office, but there's no ramp access to the post office for disabled people. So you are denying, that lack of access is on you. And the Commonwealth Bank agreed to delay until March this closure. But the Junee Council wrote a letter to 45 other councils around Australia. And in fact, It'd probably be good if we could switch, Martin. We'll come back to this, but you should show people the list, because we're talking about it's this list that Dale Webster has provided. There we go. This is the list of the 45 towns slated to shut as of the 1st of December. So the pink part of that list, if I've got it right here.
Yeah, I've just put the pink ones up. So these are the ones that have not yet closed but are planned to close.
Okay, and there's a green section that I don't know if that's available there, but if it's not, it doesn't matter. The green section is, okay. The green section is what did close in December, and the pink one is the 28 branches that are slated to close in the next few months, right? And a bunch of these are last banks in the town, like in places like Coober and Junee, right? And the Junee Council wrote to all those towns and said, fight with us. And because Junee had challenged the Commonwealth Bank for its reasons for shutting the branch. And this is quite extraordinary, because until Junee did this, and you can see with the way the media reporting works, if you read these articles, Martin, you probably notice that it's good. Although it's good that we're getting the articles, I see that the journos are still treating the subject in a fairly shallow way. So they're not really questioning the premise of the bank's decision. But Junee did. Junee is saying our bank is still in demand. You're saying customers don't use these banks anymore. Well, our bank is still being used. Our bank is still necessary. Why are you taking away our bank? And actually saying, prove to us that it's unprofitable. Show us an audit that it's unprofitable. They're sort of challenging things. And by doing that, they've invited these other councils to do it as well. So one of the councils that responded to that letter was Carnama in Western Australia. Now, Carnama is a town just a little bit away from Geraldton. And when they lose their Westpac in late February, the people of Carnama got like a 280-kilometre round trip to go to the nearest bank. So the CEO of that council was also very fired up, because he said, the banks are not giving an excuse. They're not saying why they're shutting the branch in terms of specifics. All they're saying is, people are banking digitally. And he says, I think that's BS, because he can tell from the reaction of the town that this is a branch that's required, right? And it's just not true. So anyway, that's that attention is what is starting to attract the media, right? The media is saying, okay, there is feeling out there about this. We better pay attention to it. So if we go back to my screen, let me just turn that down. All right. So this was a fairly straightforward coverage of the issue on the 19th of December. This journalist, Rhiannon Shine, has reported that once they put this out, and this is the week before Christmas, the phone rang off the hook. And so they're going to be doing a follow-up story as soon as they can, because they didn't realise that they would get the reaction that they did. And this story, we won't play it here, but you can go find it yourself, 9th of December, have a look at it. It's only 7 minutes. You'll see the head of the Banking Association, Anna Bligh, and the Financial Services Minister, Stephen Jones, both of whom are Labor politicians, just doing the bank's PR for them, accepting without question what the banks are saying. Though Jones phrased it, I remember in a fairly funny way. He said, "I've been informed that," rather than he wasn't actually that definitive about whether that was true or not. Anyway, so that was the 19th of December. Now, since then, you've had some local coverage. The Weekly Times here in Victoria, which is the main weekly rural newspaper in Victoria, has run 2 articles, big articles on the issue, including the Junee fight back. The Narracourt Herald, I think it is, in South Australia. We did a show on the Citizens Report about this. For those who watch our show, you might have seen this. There was a South Australian opposition cabinet meeting in Narracourt in South Australia, And when they had the public section part of the meeting, a local businessman got up and asked about branch closures, and the silly leader of the opposition in South Australia just said, "Oh, we'll get used to it, change or die. This is the way. This is technology. This is the way things are going. I feel sorry for you, but blah blah blah, change or die." It was pretty callous, and talk about someone who's just drunk the Kool-Aid. And clearly the locals weren't happy because they actually showed in that article that the most interesting case of a person objecting to the branch closure was a young man who, for his own purposes, has decided that he needs the benefit of using cash, and that's now being denied to him, and he's been told he's got to use a card for everything, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so that's what we started seeing is the media picking up on this theme quite a bit. And then last week, this came out in the Sydney Morning Herald. This is a very significant article. Where are all the local bank branches? And this is just some of the flavour of the coverage in this last week, which started to focus on some pretty big figures, such as 700 bank branches. So, we've been talking about regional bank branches mostly. That list is regional bank branches. But overall, 700 branches closed in 3 years. But more starkly, 53% of ATMs removed in 5 years. And that's not even the big figure. The big figure is the total number of ATMs now is 6,400, whereas 8 years ago it was 31,000. Now, these are banks that are waging a war on cash, and people are starting to notice this. So then I wanted to show you this particular thing that was just posted last night, actually. I was picking my daughter up from work, as good fathers do, and someone, actually it was Paul Thomas, who you interviewed, Martin, the cash and transit guy, sent me this. So Ben Fordham for 2GB, he put up this post like 10 o'clock last night. He goes, "I'd be keen for some specific examples of where this is suddenly an issue. We're getting a lot of messages about ATMs. They've either disappeared or been replaced by the generic machines that charge you $2 to $3 a transaction. New data shows the number of ATMs has more than halved since 2017. The banks have also shut down more than 1,600 branches. The Reserve Bank says this is due to a sharp reduction in the number of cash withdrawals, but there are still many, many people who rely on cash, particularly in regional areas. This is not customer service." Ben Fordham, that's his editorial comment. So he's asked for feedback on that. He's actually getting quite a bit, 363 comments. But he would have also received a bunch of emails because I was one of the people who emailed him with quite a few specifics about the problem. So the reason I'm excited about this is because, as you know, when you want to advance something politically, you got to break through the politicians' force shield and get their attention. And that's what media coverage allows you to do. You get their attention. Politicians are like a cat with the mesmerised by the laser light, right? And the media is the laser light, and then the politicians will flip over and do backflips to try and grab that laser light, right? And appeal to that media coverage. So this is good. We've gone from just starting to sound boring talking about this issue, but knowing it's important and adding in all the particular details we can find to just keep beating the drum, and then it gets louder and louder, and other people hear it, and it starts spreading, and suddenly it's a snowballing process. So that is excellent, and that's what we have to build on if we're going to get the breakthrough that we need. Because if we get an inquiry, then all those other issues, Martin, that you alluded to before, all of it can be looked at. Right? Different people will bring to the inquiry different things. You'll have a lot of towns saying this is our experience, etc. But we need to be able to hit that inquiry as well with the importance of cash and what cash signifies in the economy and what proper banking services signify, etc. And how this is an example, a very big example of how the banking sector as a service has well and truly lost its way.
Absolutely. And it's just worth underscoring, there's more cash in circulation, actually, from the RBA. In other words, more money printed in cash than ever before, right? Now, a lot of that probably is being stored out of the banking system in people's, under the bed or whatever. First point. Second point, a lot of people still use cash sometimes. And one of the big excuses that the banks have been using is everybody's digital, nobody uses cash, but they're very disingenuous with their statistics, aren't they? So they'll say, X% mostly use or whatever. They're not actually telling the full story here. And in fact, if you look at the statistics from within the banks themselves and what they're reporting, there's a much higher penetration of cash usage than they want to admit.
Well, can I quote the example that we talked about just before?
Yep.
ANZ in the Sydney Morning Herald article, ANZ spokesman also pointed to changes in consumer behaviour. She said, and these are the things that jump out at me now, she said only 8% of the bank's customers relied solely on branches for their everyday banking. Well, of course, I do all the basic stuff online. I don't mind doing that. But when I need to go to a bank, I need to go to a bank, right? They're trying to, if 8% are sold, also, so there's a question, this idea of solely, well, so what? There's a whole bunch of people that still rely on banking, even if they don't rely on branches, even if they don't rely on them solely. Yep. The other one is this, what are total customers? Is ANZ, does that include all its derivatives counterparties and all that sort of stuff that it's dealing with right around the world? Or is that just retail branch customers? Because you couldn't trust them to actually not rig the figures by saying, oh, let's just pad this whole figure out, right? And so this little tiny part of our business is what we don't have to worry about anymore. Those are the sort of things you've got to be aware of.
Absolutely. And Robbie, I'll tell you something, because I've had quite a few conversations with, people trying to run a town and trying to work out how to react to the banks. Earlier on, their first reaction was, well, the banks have said that's what they're going to do. Nothing we can do. We just got to roll over and let them steamroller us, right? And I kept saying, no, you don't understand, right? This battle is not yet fought, right? And we've seen a few examples where people have started writing letters. They've started to get politicians to write letters. People are starting to make a fuss. And to my mind, this making a fuss is a very important early stage in the game, right? Because what we
100%.
want is banks to understand that, we do not consent to what they're doing at the moment, right? And we're not going to just say, well, you just said it, so they're sorry, but that's it. And by the way, 2 other quick points. There goes the dogs. Sorry, that's the thunder.
I didn't hear them.
Oh, you didn't hear that? Oh, well, that's good. No, you wouldn't, I don't think. Sorry about the noise. I may need to put them away. Sorry. Just to explain, every time the thunder goes, the dogs go.
Why don't I say something for a little while, and then you come back to that?
Well, what I was going to say was that the whole point about this discussion is that there are things that can be done, and there are important messages that we need to share with the community, because all the surveys from the community show that there is still a huge need for this. So talk about that for a second. I'm just going to sort the dogs out.
Yeah, 100%. There's a Liberal senator who has written to Westpac on behalf of Kilgapedy saying, you should not be doing this, revisit your decision. And I was fairly impressed because now many of your audience might think I have a low bar, but we're talking about politicians here. On the spectrum of what politicians can do, this was more on the potent end, because most of the time what you find when you're talking to these politicians, unless they're from one of the minor parties, and then they wear their heart on their sleeve, and they're happy to get up, even whether it's One Nation or the Greens or whatever, they'll say what they think. The 2 major parties are much more inclined to be obsequious to the banks and just accept the premise of what they're saying and say, oh yeah, sorry, this is the way the world's going now, there's nothing we can do, et cetera, et cetera. No, this Liberal senator in South Australia said, hang on, you shouldn't be doing this, right? And so there's a revolt. There's what's happening in the community is reflected in the parliament. There's a revolt brewing, and it's that kind of agitation is what you build on. And whenever we do these campaigns, Martin, because we've done quite a few now, you get to see it's when it's like, I keep briefing our office here, at different stages, and you say, hey, this is starting to look like the way the cash ban campaign, for instance, unfolded, where suddenly the attention's drawn on it, people are activating, that sort of thing. And it is going to break through, and then at a certain point will be an open warfare with the banks. But that's where I want to be, right? I want the banks to be having to come out and address this and attack us and whatever, because when it's the people who represent, the interests of the people, the citizens, etc., versus the banks, we can't lose.
No, well, exactly. And a couple of other observations. The banks keep arguing that banks cost money. It's basically a drain on their profitability, et cetera, and nobody's using it, so therefore it makes sense. Now, the point is how they account for their branch network is it's done in such a way that they weight all the costs to the branch, but all of the profitability from the products that are sold through the branches are held centrally. So it's a complete furphy to say that branches are actually intrinsically unprofitable. And I was talking the other day to somebody who's involved with one of the local community banks locally here, and they say, no, our branch is perfectly profitable, works very well, and it's because of course they account for it differently, right? So there's an accounting decision being taken at head office somewhere to deliberately smear the costs down to the branches and take the profits elsewhere. So that's why this whole idea of an audit is really, really important, right? Well, if they're going to claim that they're actually losing money hand over fist, and by the way, the banks make huge amounts of profit anyway. So that's the first point. The other point is there's a thing called a universal service obligation, right? Which means that it says you have the right to be a bank in Australia because we have allowed you to become a bank because, but there is a quid pro quo for that, right? You get all the support from government, you get the term funding facility from the RBA, you basically can inherit the credit rating of the government because everybody knows that the government stands behind the banks. But there's a quid pro quo for that, and that's actually providing a range of services to meet community needs and expectations. And for me, the question of community needs and expectations is where this conversation has to go to, right? Because the whole idea of saying nobody wants it is completely awry with all the information that I'm seeing from all of my surveys and from all of the other analysis I'm doing, and the fact all the research around the world says if you close a branch and there's no branch locally, you strangle the community and it dies. So this is a really important, conversation.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine, Peter Cribbett, who's an economist, he used to work in the Productivity Commission. He came up with a brilliant analogy for how the banks think in this way, because he put out a recommendation. I saw him on Twitter and I retweeted. He put out a recommendation for families. He said, don't have kids, they're a cost centre. Whereas many people would say, well, hang on, but that's the whole bait. We want to be a family, and once upon a time, banks knew serving customers, which they now all they think about is as a cost centre. Yep. That is banking. Hello, that is what banking used to be, but now it's not. And I think we should talk about that. I want to tell you about a book, but can I share the screen again just quickly, Martin? I did want to not promote our own show here, but I just want to show some clips. This is the other thing that happened before Christmas. And if you haven't seen this show, this is our show from 2 weeks ago called Citizens Report 13th of the 1st, Change or Die, and it's about 30 minutes in. Because we do long-winded shows now. Sorry about that. But these are clips from, this is the National Australia Bank's annual general meeting. And And a gentleman named Michael Sanderson went along and asked him a bunch of questions, but he had a batch of questions on branch closures. And we play the highlights of those clips. So this is the NAB CEO responding to him. This is I'll just jump forward here. This is the ANZ CEO responding to him, to Michael. This is the Westpac CEO responding to Michael. And the reason I thought I'd just share that now is because he asked every single one of those banks, is your reason for shutting branches that they're unprofitable? And will you subject that? If so, will you subject that to an audit? None of them touched that question. None of them. They just went on and made these motherhood statements about how this is Ian Macfarlane, who's now here's the banking oligopoly for you, Martin. That gentleman you just saw then, I mean, nothing against him personally, but that's Ian Macfarlane, very famous, as one of the most famous CEOs of ANZ in our history. 20-odd years ago, he was the CEO of ANZ, Ian Macfarlane up there on the left. He's now the chairman of Westpac. What did George Carlin say? It's a big club and you're not in it. But anyway, I digress. That is, this was really good work by Michael, taking the question right up to them in their AGMs. Michael's part of what they call bank warriors, who they all go and buy one share each in all the banks so they can qualify to go to the AGM and ask them these very, very pointed questions. And this is when the management has to get exposed to the masses of the great unwashed. But this was very, very useful. It showed you what they want to duck as an issue, all right?
Yep.
Now, I want to promote a book here. Sorry, share my screen again, if you don't mind, just quickly. This was my reading over Christmas. This is a new book. It came out last year. The author is a South African who lives in Europe. Cloud Money, Cash Cards, Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets. What I can vouch for in this book is the main theme, which is about cash. Apparently, he's made some enemies in the crypto community. They dispute some of the things he says about that. But I think his points about cash are very, very sound. So we can get off that now. But I just want to give you the highlights of what he's saying. So he goes through. This is a guy who he calls himself an economic anthropologist. He's a journalist, etc. But because of his area of expertise, these are my notes from people I'll just highlight them, but people can follow along as I'm talking. Because of his area of expertise, he's been following these developments for fintech, crypto, etc. from the get-go, right? And so what he's done now after 15 odd years of this is take a step back and say, okay, I have this quite in-depth understanding of how the whole financial system works. What conclusions do I draw? Well, my main conclusion is we cannot allow them to get rid of cash. And so he makes some overarching points. First of all, one of his points is what we're experiencing is not a revolution. The digital revolution is not a revolution in the sense that it's a total transformation of the way the financial sector works. No, it is the same globalized banking oligopoly. All digital is doing is allowing them to automate their existing practices. This is an automation, not revolution. That's one of his points. And so the question is, why should we have to go along with that? The second thing is he makes a very fundamental distinction between types of money, because he says a lot of what people discuss about money is the surface changes between money, right? But there are fundamental types of money. And the biggest distinction he makes is between state money and bank money. And state money is central bank reserves and cash, which is the physically printed central bank reserves issued by the state. But in the form of cash, it's the most reliable, the most flexible, the most private. Cash is the only form of money that ticks every box, right? In terms of usability. Bank money is entirely digital. It's controlled by the banking system, and he compares it to casino chips, which you get in exchange for cash. When you take your money to the bank and you give them cash and they register that in your bank account, that money you now have in the bank is no longer the cash. It's bank money. right? That is digital money the banks control. And your only way to get out of the bank and the bank money, the off-ramp, is getting it back into cash, right? So he's not trying to say we shouldn't have bank money. He does point out that banks can create much more than they have in reserves, right? All those sort of things. But in a sense, when you're using bank money, it's like you've gone to a casino and given them cash and got chips, and you can only use those chips inside the casino. He makes another good point. He says the banks want the public to think move to a cashless society is the equivalent of moving from the horse and cart to the horseless carriage, right? He uses the word horseless deliberately because he wants to compare horseless to cashless. But he says that is rubbish. Saying cashless is as useful as calling whiskey beerless alcohol, right? What he says, when it comes to cash, it's a different thing. He said it's more, if you want to make a comparison, cash is more like the bicycle. It's a different type of transport, but it would be unthinkable to get rid of it, right? Because it's yes, it's slower, but it's available to everyone to use freely. It's very flexible, and only corrupt people would want to get rid of it. He then devotes a whole chapter to the fact that, and this comes out in every article, the banks claim, and many people think, that it's the consumers that are driving this. And if you go watch that 7:30 report story, both Stephen Jones and Anna Bligh said the consumers want to go digital. That's why we're doing this, right? And every newspaper, every article I've seen, like Sky News this morning or yesterday morning, when they were talking about some of these statistics of the shutting down of ATMs, they said the consumers are driving this. And he says that is rubbish. In reality, the banks are making the decision for them because it's not in the consumer's interest, it's in the bank's interest. And what they do is they use marketers and influencers to make people assume that everyone's doing it, so they should be doing it, right? This is the oldest marketing ploy in the book. They then demonize cash. Suddenly the thing that before the 80s, no one would ever have thought to demonize cash the way we're demonizing it. Cash was cash. It was just, that was how you interact with the economy, with cash, right? Now suddenly it's old-fashioned, it's inefficient, and then the worst one is it's dangerous. Cash is used in crime and tax evasion. Well, really? So old-fashioned, yeah, until the power goes out, until the internet fails, then the old-fashioned guy with the cash is the only one who can buy stuff, right? That's why you keep cash. Inefficient. And I won't do justice to this, but it's what cash, the digital, waving your phone or your card over one of those little PayWave cards, that seems such a simple thing to do, so much simpler than handing over a piece of paper and waiting for your change, right? But the technical complexities behind that action are mind-blowing. And it's generating there's enormous volumes of messages flying back and forth, seeking permission. When you buy something with your card or with cash or with your phone, you are asking the bank's permission to buy something. And then the banks, if they give you that permission, they tell the other bank, you have that permission. And then there's all this like digital communication flying back and forth in the back room. It's all very, very complicated, right? Yet you're told it's very, very simple. So that may be the same. It's like modern cars. They're lovely to drive, but no one can fix them, right? Because they're all computerized and whatever. So it's similar to that, but there's nothing simple about it, right? So what you're giving up, it's a different perspective on the question of how efficient it is. And then the one about dangerous, he just took the gloves off, because the real organised crime in the world. Go watch there's a film you can watch on YouTube called The Spider's Web, right, which is about the offshore banking centre, the big tax evasion, the big money laundering, the vast majority of it happens through bank transfers to offshore tax havens, right? If you really wanted to go after that sort of crime, you wouldn't even be looking at cash. Cash is, in fact, as Craig Ishwood pointed out on our show last week, cash, because it's physical, it has bulk, is a certain limiting factor on how much money you can actually launder, Whereas the really big stuff, the idea that you would single out cash, this is just self-serving propaganda by the banks. And then the big one, of course, is once the banks have done all that, then they force the process by closing the branches and removing the ATMs. What they're doing is they're taking away the ramps out of the banking system. It's the equivalent, he compares it to, you've been in the casino, then you take your chips to cash out, and the casino says to you, sorry, you can't cash out, you've got to stay here and spend your chips here, right? We wouldn't accept that. That's what we're accepting with the process that is happening underway. And so Brett Scott's conclusion, and it's worth reading the details of the book, but his conclusion is not about overly demonizing the banking system, although it deserves to be demonized. His point is, if you take cash away, you take away the balance to that banking oligopoly's power. When there's cash, we, the people, we get to balance their power by our own private personal decision-making and the cumulative effect of that. You take that away, they have all the power at that point, right? And yes, you could come up with a central bank digital currency, which would be the equivalent of state money, and it'd be programmed to be that way. But of course, that's not without problems either, is it? That you lose the privacy, you lose the reliability. You're again at the mercy of the power system, of the internet, etc. It is not. It is. There may be some practical application for central bank digital currencies between settling things between the private banks, etc. But to say that is some fantastic revolution over just basic cash is losing sight of the real value of what actual cash is. So I think it's a really valuable book. The fact that this guy has written is because what we're dealing with in Australia is a global problem. It's happening everywhere at once. The banks are pushing this. In Europe, though, they've been pushing it a bit hard. They're a bit longer than they've been pushing it here. Now they're getting pushed back, and we need to generate the pushback here in Australia. So there's my book review for the day, Martin.
Well, thanks, Robbie. And, there's some really important points there. I just want to sort of unpack central bank digital currency slightly more, right? Because there is an alignment of technologies around digital payments, digital ID, transaction data, and, big data, all of those things together. And the problem that I see is that if we actually allow ourselves to drift into this digital future where everything is tracked and everything is connected and everything is effectively within that big data environment, we've given up freedoms, we've given up resilience and redundancy when the power goes down, because suddenly everything stops when the power goes down. And by the way, that's one of the big reasons why up in some Scandinavian countries they've actually turned turtle now and said, no, we need to actually keep cash in the system because we can't let these big organisations run the whole system. All right. And the central bank digital currency story, even in Australia, is very vague. It's of course being driven by the RBA and this entity, which is a combination of academics and other organisations who actually have an interest in pushing this. There has been no consultation with ordinary people about this in Australia through the pilots that are currently running. So this is another case where effectively a central bank digital currency mantra is being driven top down, and you can draw the line directly from Australia back up through to the World Economic Forum and for the Bank of International Settlements, because they're all saying, well, this will be good, but actually a top-down directive of everybody should have this doesn't cut the mustard for me. And again, this is another example where if we're not careful, we're going to give up individual freedoms, individual accountabilities and individual flexibility. I'm not against digital per se. I'm quite happy for people to have the choice if they want to go digital, but we need also the valid option of not going digital, not being forced to dance that particular tune. And I'd also make the point that if you go into crypto land and see all the scams that have been there in the last few months, digital is not without its problems. Plus, of course, you've got all of the question of digital IDs the piracy of digital identity and all those things as well. So it's not like cash is bad, digital's good. Actually, there's a whole bunch of questions on the digital side of the ledger which are equally or probably more intrusive and more difficult to deal with. And yet, the politicians who are being fed lines by the banks are actually preaching the cash is bad, digital's good story. And I have a real problem with that.
Well, that's why I think this book is a great contribution, because I think the distinction, an actual understanding of what cash is as a different type, a fundamental type of money different to digital bank money, is really important. So it's not just thinking, oh, well, this is a technological advance. No, you're giving up something.
Yep.
Right. He actually makes a point. He said the banks like using the term cashless society because they're drawing people's attention to something that's not there. The reality is, he said, it would be harder to sell if they called it the bank chip society. Right. We're now the bank chip society, only bank money society. Right. That's what actually cashless means. So that's very important. And then the other practical part of the book is this question of balance. Now, putting aside the fact that you still got to, we're still fighting to reform the banking system, but have your technology. But when you understand what cash is, and the analogy to the bicycle, it's unthinkable to give it up. And by having it, that's always balance to these other things. Now, I've been looking at the central bank digital currency stuff myself, and what I've learned, and I've actually been able to speak to some people who are real experts in blockchain and all those sort of technologies. And there's different approaches to this whole thing, and you can even program real safeguards into them. But in terms of the checklist, I think theoretically, I might be wrong, but so I'm just telling you the various things I'm gleaning. I think theoretically you could have a central bank digital currency where even privacy is programmed in a certain way. Yep. And so that takes that problem away. However, when you do it the whole checklist, like the your checklist of bank services in Cooper Pedy compared to all the digital ones, when you do the whole checklist, as you can have the most fantastic central bank digital currency, but if the power fails and the internet goes out for any number of reasons, you're back to square one anyway. Whereas the person who's got cash in their wallet is the person who can always transact in all circumstances unless they take that option away. It's fundamentally about the importance of balance. The problem that I have been reacting to in politicians for a long time is they're inclined to be. Now, I'm not sure what it is. I don't automatically think they're on the take, but they're inclined to be gullible when it comes to modern technology and think they should embrace all of it. Right? Oh, this is the new world. This is the way things are done. I don't want to be seen to be a Luddite. Right? We'll be called Luddites for having this conversation. I don't want to be seen to be a Luddite. You've got to embrace it. Now, I've mentioned on your show over the last few years a couple of times my view on Uber. And I reacted to the same thing with the politicians then. And I was denouncing Uber long before London banned it and other countries banned it, etc. But I want to just draw out one aspect of Uber, just that I used on my show recently. 1/3 of what you pay your Uber driver, again, through this very complicated electronic permission system that goes through the cloud and all around the world, 1/3 of that money is immediately siphoned out of Australia into the British Virgin Islands. Whereas when we had taxis and you hated the smell and you hated the guy taking an extra 5 minutes because he didn't know, and all those things you told me you hate about taxis, and that's why Uber's such a great revolution and we should have smashed all the taxis, bugger them. But every time you handed cash to that taxi driver, that cash stayed in your town. 100% of it, and it fed his kids, and it went to the milk bar, and it went to the other store, and it circulated in the town, 100% of it. And now every time you use an Uber, 1/3 of that money is siphoned out of Australia, probably tax-free, into the British Virgin Islands. And all because some arseholes invented an app that allowed them to figure out a way to break the laws that govern taxis. That's my view of Uber. And the politicians just absolutely embraced it until it got so much that a lot of people were like, okay, we're starting to see the problems here. And it never made a profit, and it was funded by Google and the Saudis to fund its losses, and it was doing predatory pricing and all those things that are supposed to be illegal. Uber was allowed to do it. And the politicians just accepted it because this is new technology. And they're doing the same thing now with this. This is what they do. This is new technology. Hang the consequences. Well, let me tell you the consequence of this one. There was a young Channel 10 reported last week, young couple here in Melbourne, therefore internet savvy. They're not novices. They got scammed out of $100,000, which was their savings for their house, the deposit on their house, lost it all because they were getting text messages on their phone from the same number that Westpac used for them. So they got a series of text messages from Westpac over however period of time. And then there's one day they're getting other text messages from Westpac. And yes, there are other red flags that they were thinking, well, why, they should have thought, why are we being told to do this? But the fact it's coming from Westpac, right, conned this young couple into transferring $100,000 and they've lost it. Now, Westpac benefits enormously from the fact this young people does their banking online. This young couple does their banking online, just like they want to get everyone to do their banking online. That benefits them enormously. But when this young couple lost their $100,000, what did Westpac say? Not our problem. And you and I have been privy to horror stories, thanks to, well, not just that. Where's my? I did cue this one up too, Martin. I mean, I just want to show this for the benefit of the little plug for Dale Webster here. If you're on Twitter, get onto this account, the regional. This is Dale Webster's, and what she's been doing is going through the submissions to the regional banking task force, which had a garbage outcome, but she's just been highlighting all these quotes from people just describing the experience of being forced to go bankless and cashless in the regions, and she has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these examples, and follow her. They'll turn up in your feed and you will see brought home every day just what this experience is actually like, right? This is having a real cost in the real world. They're doing greenwashing. As you know, greenwashing is when you do things to claim that you're doing it for the environment. And banks, we've now found out that banks are actually counting the closure of branches towards their reduction in carbon emissions, except they're forcing those customers to go on these massive, long, hundreds of kilometres round trips to go to the next bank because they have to do their banking. So that's one of the things they do. One of the stories we got was about libraries in regional towns where the little old people go to the library and say, please, I've been told I got registered for online banking. The branch is shut. I can't bank anywhere. I don't know how to use this thing. I don't have internet at home. Can I do this here? And, of course, the librarian's being helpful. And the librarian ends up knowing the username and password. And that is an enormous breach of security. And when something goes wrong there, the bank will quickly blame that customer for sharing their username and password, right? Not our problem. So they're herding people into this danger. The internet is a dangerous place. The security on the internet is awful, right? And people I've come close to being suckered, and you just sort of catch yourself at the last minute. Unfortunately, the most gullible people out there are the elderly who aren't sophisticated enough, and the banks just aren't going to care. So they're going to force everyone into this, and then when all these organised crime scammers, etc., and some of this is really sophisticated. I played for our office. There's a really fantastic YouTube channel by a young ex-NASA engineer named Mark Rober. I don't know if people are familiar. You got to get on it. And if you got kids, especially, get it. He does all this fantastic engineering stuff that's really entertaining, etc., and kids love it. But he's the guy who started off by making a glitter bomb for the people who come and steal the packages from your porch, right? And he rigged it to explode in their face with stink bombs and glitter and all this sort of stuff and film it and whatnot. That's how he became famous. Well, he keeps an eye on that side of thing, and he's done a couple of fantastic episodes on online banking scams. And one of them is he gives an explanation of how this works, and most people wouldn't have a clue. This little old lady is talking to a guy from India on the phone, and what she doesn't know is that he's told her to download a program which has given him off-site access to her computer behind a screen. Like she sees the normal screen, behind that is the real screen, and he has her bank account details, and he's emptying her bank. He's making her, he creates a fake image of it. He puts in $20,000, making it look like that he has overpaid her and he's going to lose his job. And so frantically, she agrees to get $20,000 in cash and send it to him so he doesn't lose his job, right? And that's all the money she's got in the bank, etc. And this is super sophisticated stuff. You look at it and think, well, I might even fall for that, right? The little old people who before this era, banking was 100% certain for them. The only thing that was dangerous about it is if they happened to live in the freaking deep south and, Bonnie and Clyde came and robbed their bank while they were there, right? Aside from that, banking was 100% certain. Go to the bank, do your banking, get your passport filled in. You know what's in there. You got your checkbook. You're doing your own calculations. There was certainty about the process. Now they're being forced into something that's completely uncertain. The banks are forcing them into it. We went those figures last time you and I did a joint show with the way NAB registers people, and only 25% have ended up using it regularly. The banks are forcing them into it, taking away their choice by removing the branch and the ATM. And when it all starts going bad for a lot of people, the banks will be saying, not our problem. And the politicians, if we don't beat them up politically by hammering with them with those phone calls, etc. Understand, you've got to break through their psychology. They cannot sit on their hands and let this process happen. This wouldn't be an issue if the banks were telling the truth that the consumer was driving this. We're reflecting the anger that's out there. This is what Dale Webster's Twitter feed is all about. There's anger because the consumer isn't driving this. The banks are forcing it. And the worst part is the politicians are letting them. So we have more say over the politicians. Use it. And that's why this campaign is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely, Robbie. And, the next couple of months in particular will be really important. We'll perhaps talk about in a second. But I just want to make a couple of points. The first is, of course, the banks are claiming that, well, Australia Post is a perfect replacement for the local branch, right? And you mentioned, I just want to reiterate it, the Cooper PD guys got a list of all of the current functions that are available in the branch at Cooper PD, right? This is from the bank itself, and the bank then identified which ones would be available through Australia Post and which ones would not be available through Australia Post. And basically, it's a very short list, right? And then you discover that there are limits on the availability of cash via the Australia Post solution, firstly. Secondly, of course, the banks are paying a very small amount of money to Australia Post, much less than they should, to provide those services. And the local community business owners of the LPOs are effectively caught in the headlights here, right? So the point I'm making is that the current solution that the banks are putting up, other than go digital, well, great if you've got digital connectivity, but how many people in the bush don't have reliable connectivity? And how many people don't have access to the functionality they need to be able to do their banking through the licensed post office outlet? Which is why the whole concept of saying, well, just flick it over to Australia Post is way too limited. Which is why we are saying, no, there has to be a better solution. So either the banks actually step up and do what they should be doing, or what we do is we actually find an alternative solution that essentially can provide the range of services. And by the way, if you actually created an entity that provided real service for people, guess what? Everyone will flock to it, right? And of course, that's what the banks are really paranoid about, because they know that they actually could lose a hell of a lot of business if, in fact, there was another entity who could compete. And Kiwi Bank, I guess, in New Zealand is a bit of an example of how that might play out.
No, exactly. It's a great example. They started Kiwi Bank, and the first thing the private banks did was declare a moratorium on branch closures. But see, I mean, the banks are they're so full of shit. They're so disingenuous. And so they've been going around there parading and saying, oh, we've got Australia Post. If people go and look at the Michael Sanderson's questions to Westpac doubled down and emphasised, oh, no, we're not abandoning these towns. We have this deal with Australia Post. We're providing our banking services for Australia Post. But these MFers won't pay properly for it. So in the mid-90s, they calculated that the average branch cost about $1.5 million a year. The latest claim I saw in one of these articles I think it was in the Sydney Morning Herald article the other day, it was $1 million a year. That's probably because there's fewer staff now or whatever. Okay. They used to pay Australia Post, when Christine Holgate did the deal with them, $20 million a year. Once they got rid of Christine Holgate, we know they slashed what they're prepared to pay for Bank at Post to $10 million or less, right? Pauline Hanson asked a question on notice in Parliament back in November. The government didn't know the answer, and she asked a question without notice. The government didn't know the answer, and they took it on notice. So I'm waiting for the government's response to this, how much the banks paid. What we know is they didn't pay the full $20 million. They cut it in half, just as they were massively expanding their reliance on Bank at Post to serve their customers right around Australia. And so if it's probably more than half, they cut it by, but if it's just half, closing 10 branches is the equivalent of what they're paying to Australia Post. Now, $10 million a year, and they've closed a lot more than that, right? They're closing into the hundreds of branches, and the cheap-ass bastards, while they're still making mega profits, the cheap-ass bastards won't pay properly for the Bank at Post service. And at a certain point, people have just got to take the gloves off with these banks and denounce them. You are full of shit, right? You cannot deal with these people in any kind of respectful way. You got to treat them like vicious dogs that may have a purpose, but only if they're chained up, right? That's what we used to say about the need for Glass-Steagall as a leash on the banks. But in this particular case, yeah, let's actually call their bluff. And the way to call their bluff is say, okay, you clearly don't want to serve customers. That's your whole thing now. You want to form a banking where you don't have to provide service. Okay, well, let's have a bank that does provide service. You say that people all want to do digital banking, and that's why you're closing branches. Well, if you're right, our bank won't work, right? But you don't want to be in that space anyway. We'll start a government bank, and this is why one of the reasons the Commonwealth Bank was started originally. The branches are there, 4,300 post offices around Australia. A government bank operate through those, or the post office will be the exclusive agency for the government bank. Your local post person will not be approving your loan. There will be a back end of proper bankers to do that, working for the government bank, but it'll provide full banking services through the post office, full. And one of the most important things it has to do is keep cash available for everybody, right, for all the small businesses. And it'll take a bit of money to start it up, like Kiwi Bank did. Kiwi Bank required $60 million in initial startup capital from the New Zealand government, paid it back like that. And then it's self-funding. It pays for itself. And everybody who wants to use face-to-face services can use that bank. And what will happen is the Australia Post and the licensed post offices will receive so much extra revenue from being the agency for this bank, which the way we've written the bill that we wrote is it's written in there that the revenue that goes to them must be adequate for their needs, right? None of this being, cheapskating like the private banks do. That'll provide the funds for the investment in infrastructure, the security, all those sort of things that it's going to have to happen. Christine Holgate was in the process of rolling that out around Australia before she got toppled. And then, let the banks compete, right? You don't want to be in this space? Well, what are you complaining about? What the banks will do is scream blue murder, but that's the battle that we have to have, because back to this question of balance, just like cash is a balance to the power of the banks, a bank that actually serves people, right, and is accountable to the public because it's a government bank, is also a balance to the power of the private banks. And I think, this is where this is going to lead. And it's both. And I don't even care if the banks do lift their game. I doubt if they will, right? But it's both and. It'll be chicken and egg a little bit, but even it might be being spooked by the idea of a government bank that makes them start lifting their game and stop closing branches and maybe even reopen some. But if it's just the idea, they'll just do that as long as they think they've held the idea off. If we actually achieve it, then watch what happens. Because the real giveaway, Martin, that this whole digital excuse is crap. There was the two previous inquiries into bank branch closures in Australia were in 1999 and 2004. And there was no freaking digital revolution then compared to what we've been going through in the last few years, let me assure you. Do you know why it was? Because as soon as the Commonwealth Bank was sold, the bank started mass closing branches and laying off workers. They couldn't wait to do it. Why did they have to wait till the Commonwealth Bank sold, though? Because as a public bank, the Commonwealth Bank wasn't there to maximise profit, right? It had to provide a service as a public bank. And the private banks knew they had to compete with that. And did they make profits? Yes, they made profits. Plenty of fat cat bankers in those days as well, right? Making their profits. But we had a banking system that knew that they had to serve the community. As soon as the Commonwealth Bank was gone, the bank started mass closing branches. And digital was not their excuse. They just want to get rid of having to serve the public. And they use the fact that they're a cartel. This is why you have laws against being cartels, but they are a cartel. Cartels don't have to put the customer first, right? They rig it so the customer serves them, and that's what the private banks are doing.
Absolutely. And there's another factor to bear in mind here, because of course we know that our larger financial institutions are very exposed internationally to derivatives. They're very exposed potentially to risky mortgage lending, particularly as property prices fall, all of those things. So deposits sitting in these large organisations are sitting inside the same entity as those other risk exposures. And so therefore there is some potential risk. Probably not high in Australia, but it's certainly there. And around the world, there's this concept of bail-in, where effectively your savings are converted into equity in the bank to prop the bank up, as in in the Northern Hemisphere. We've seen a few examples there. If you have a government bank that's actually there for the community and provides a service, there's no risk of bail-in for funds held within that entity. And it seems to me that that's another very compelling reason as to why this makes a hell of a lot of sense, again, in de-risking the financial system in Australia.
Yeah, well, the ex-Goldman Sachs banker who oversaw the TARP bailout, his name escapes me at the moment. The TARP bailout was the $700 billion bailout in America, the initial bailout money. That guy became an enormous advocate of Glass-Steagall, but also he went a step further, and he said in his view, commercial banks should be treated just as utilities. Just use these in comparison to a nuclear power station, heavily regulated for safety. Heavily regulated for safety, because that's what was primary. So it's got a job. It's got a function. That for it to function properly, it's got to be heavily regulated for safety. And the idea of those banks, and he said, and I think he even might have got to the point that just treat them like utilities, and you might even make them all public. But it was just that idea that there's a bank. The banking system has a core function, and that core function needs to be protected. But we don't. We've got well and truly away from that. And one way to bring it back is through Glass-Steagall separation and force the banks to, that hold deposits to never have anything to do with speculation, and we should have that anyway. But another way is to provide a safe haven in the banking system through a public bank. Your deposits are 100% guaranteed because you've deposited with the government, and you don't have. It'll be something that attracts deposits for that purpose, and then those deposits can be earmarked not for any kind of crazy speculation, but for banking in the real economy. And I was going to, I was going to play a clip, which we can't do. We might get flagged in this show, but I do want to recommend. It was only the other day I got around to watching the movie Margin Call, and it's one of the movies about the global financial crisis. I'd seen a lot of the others, but this one took me a while to watch it. Anyway, there's a beautiful scene in there. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I recommend everyone watch it. Type into YouTube, Margin Call, I Built a Bridge. Because one of these financial guys, all hell's breaking loose, the shit's hit the fan, and he's sitting on the steps of his house, and he's clearly thinking about what might have been. And he explains to his offsider how he's actually an engineer, and he tells him how he built a bridge once before he got into banking. And then he goes through, because it's a bit of a show-off scene, he knows how to calculate things in his head, that this bridge over a ravine between two towns saves, he just starts rattling off how many hours of travel a day, a month, a year, kilometres saved, etc., because they built a bridge that saved a big, long round trip. In other words, it illustrates really well how he used to have a job in the real world doing something productive, right, that made an enormous difference to people's lives. And then he lost his way and went into banking and ended up at Lehman Brothers and just circling the toilet bowl with the rest of them. And what we've got to do, I like bringing home to people, this is what the economy is about. Our ability to build that bridge, not whether, it's not an economic advance that I saw, I had to do a double take the other day that, not only is Elon Musk the richest man who's ever lived, but he's lost the most money of any man who's ever lived.
Yep.
And it's all bullshit, fictitious crap. It's got nothing to do with anything. Zero to do with anything. At least that is his side hobby. He does some interesting things. But those values are meaningless values. But people get mesmerized with that. The real world is, can we provide the services and infrastructure that people need to live lives in the economy? And that includes all people, including the grandma who needs to go to the bank so that she can get some money out and give her grandkids some pocket money or pay for their tuition or whatever she might want to do, right? That's what the real economy is. Can we manufacture things? Can we? And our banking system has well and truly lost its way. And if we had a public bank that went back to the basics, including the ability to do the long-term investments, that the banks will say, oh, yeah, well, no, we make commercial decisions. Yeah, you do. You make things to maximize your short-term profits to boost your bonuses. We need to be, banking is a powerful mechanism, very powerful. Some of that power needs to be earmarked for the public good, and that's what a public bank can do. And it's not an ideological position. The people who hate it are ideological. It's just pure common sense. And it was the norm in Australian history. We had a public bank for 84 years until we sold it. When we sold it, we set loose a rapacious banking oligopoly that is growing like a cancer at the expense of the economy. So instead of the banking system making its money by helping the rest of the economy grow, the banking system now grows by cannibalizing the rest of the economy. What they call growth in their annual reports is coming from slashing this expense, slashing that expense, right? And we've had 3 or 4 decades of banks doing this now. They do it to the economy, they do it to themselves internally, right? And we're circling the toilet bowl as a result. And that's, these are the very, very significant overtones of this very, very practical campaign we're running at the moment. We're laying the foundation to address all of that.
Yes, and it's worth just reflecting again, just to re-emphasize that the banking system should be there as an enabling capability to enable real businesses to do things and, to invest in real things. And by the way, if we had, a public entity that actually created funds, taking savings, and then putting it into real investments in real infrastructure development, then that would actually be a very powerful thing. At the moment, what we're finding is that the banks actually don't really want to lend to businesses. As I said earlier on, what they really want to do is to bid up home prices so that they can actually lend ever bigger mortgages and inflate their balance sheets, and creating this spurious wealth effect sitting in the real economy, right? Because of course everybody thinks, oh, my house price is now doubled, so I must be really wealthy. Yeah. Mind you, most of it's just offset by a loan. Yep. And in the meantime, what we've done is we've completely lost the compass direction in terms of where we need to go as a country, and where we need to actually be building stuff for the future, and laying a foundation to enable Australia to be a more prosperous country, not just in hock to an ever bigger banking system. And the other side of it, Robbie, is I actually think that a lot of politicians are really scared of the banks, because the banks have played quite dirty and quite long, and they've got tentacles everywhere, and they've also, of course, got very strong connections with a lot of people inside politics, and there's an open door between politics and the banks and politics, right? So, there's a very important issue here, and I had the guy who wrote, all about the fact that there are these hidden power groups and the power connections, Cameron Murray in Australia, right? The financial system, the bank, Game of Mates, and the republished slightly different version of it. That's actually how Australia is at the moment. So we've got to break the mold. And all of this conversation leads to the fact that we know what's going on, we know what needs to be done, and so therefore now we've got to push the conversation to really make some of these changes. Because if we don't, we're going to end up, frankly, complete prisoners of the banking system, and the financial system will be calling all of the shots. And the way I explain it, sometimes it's like the event horizon and a black hole. We're getting closer and closer to the event horizon and the black hole. The more and more of the economy is getting effectively sucked into the bank. It's just sort of going, everything is being contaminated. And it's a neoliberal philosophy, and it's actually free market economics and all of those things, but it's not really. But it's not actually doing what it should be doing, which is in enabling businesses to thrive and households to thrive in Australia. And interestingly, I noticed that a report came out in the UK just recently. More than half of people in the UK are now actually receiving more from government than they're paying in taxes. Just think about that.
Yeah. And that's what happens now, until austerity gets forced on them. But that's what happens. The government ends up filling the gap that the banks have created through their neoliberal agenda, right? Where the UK used to be a fantastically productive economy. They turned the whole of the northern industrial area into a rust belt. There's always this inverse relationship with the decline of the economy and the rise of entertainment and sport. A lot more money goes into those things to keep the masses distracted. But the bread and butter stuff they used to do, they don't do, and the government has to pick up the bill. I can trace that back to the decisions that were started by the woman who came to power railing against all that, Margaret Thatcher. There is no such thing as society. We don't need the state. Blah blah blah. And what ends up happening is the state has to fill the gap. But in the time we've got left, Martin, we need to focus on the enemy image. I want to name a politician. Now, I'm not saying you should absolutely hate the guy, but we've got to put him under enormous pressure. And I'm talking about Stephen Jones. There's an easy name to remember. And he's your freaking neighbour, the member for Whitlam. So Stephen Jones is the Financial Services Minister, people. And he's the guy that all the politicians pass the buck and say to me, he's the one who, has to, essentially make the decision on this. Well, if we do what we've got to do in terms of getting solutions, it'll be a full cabinet decision. But this guy is a particular problem. And an example, back to politicians fearing the banks, is what happened in November last year in the Parliament. Now, I don't know if you and I spoke on this show after that. I don't think we did, or maybe we did. But just to remind the audience, and I can testify, I was there, Glenn Isherwood was there, and John Adams was there in Parliament on the Wednesday night. We were there, we caught up with John, he was there for different reasons. And we saw the evidence and the newspaper article that came out and said the Greens and Stephen Jones had done a deal to bring in civil penalties for bankers, for bank executives. And this was something the Greens have been pushing for a long time, and the proof was there. It was in the press, they'd done the deal. And it was like, we knew it was a big deal because I knew how much the Greens have been pushing for this. This meant that when the banks, are doing bad things, the executives who should have known don't get to say, oh, we will look, they don't get away with looking the other way, right? They're going to be held accountable, including with fines. Now, the next evening, suddenly the deal's off. Why? Because Anna Bligh called the CEO of the Banking Association, called Jim Chalmers, her fellow Queensland Labor Member of Parliament, and Stephen Jones, the Financial Services Minister, and conveyed the wishes of the banks, and they dropped the deal. And just last week, Jones was in the press saying, doubling down on the fact that he thinks that the existing bill before the deal with the Greens was perfect. That's what we're going to go with, right? They bowed the knee to the bankers.
Yep.
And the fact that Anna Bligh is there is, as the head of the Banking Association, tells you an awful lot. Now, the same Stephen Jones, back in August 2019, Stephen, when they unveiled the cash ban bill, that to send Australians to jail for spending their own money, Stephen Jones, this was the government's bill, the Morrison government's bill. The first thing Labor said about it was said by Stephen Jones, and he said, oh, yeah, we'll support that. And that's when we took the gloves off. Now, we beat them back on that. And in fact, Stephen Jones was one of the first to jump after coming under enormous pressure. We beat them back on that and defeated that bill. It took about a bit over a year to fully kill it off, but that was an enormous campaign, which everyone will remember. You and John were doing regular updates on your show. You and I were doing updates. Our whole, it dominated the whole of 2019 for the rest of the year, remember? And we forced hearings. John Adams got to testify at the hearings. It was really, really powerful campaign. We beat them back on that. But that was Stephen Jones for you. And now Stephen Jones is the issue again. And so the only way to deal with him and his government is got to take the gloves off. And so this is to appeal to people. Look at our website. We put out a release today. We need, if you support this campaign to stop regional bank closures and expose what's actually going on, save cash, win the war on cash, right? The first thing we need is to get up this inquiry in the week from the 6th to the 9th of February. That's the first sitting week. But it's got to be that week because it's a Senate inquiry in the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee. And the Senate only sits for that first week. And the second week, they're doing estimates. So we need to have a motion put up, in that first week, and it needs to be voted on. And so we need all the senators, or we need the majority of senators to support it because it goes to a vote. Our understanding is the members of the committee are supportive. They, Martin North and Dale Webster wrote a letter to them on the 17th of November last year. The members of the committee, of the committee are supportive, but it's got to go to a vote. So what we need is everybody to make phone calls to senators. And just start with the senators in your state. And if you want the list, you just go to our website and look at our press release, citizensparty.org.au, or you can go to the Parliament House website and look at senators and members. But if you're in New South Wales, call the 10 senators in New South Wales. Call an email. If you're in Victoria, call an email the 10 senators in Victoria. If you're in South Australia, etc. It's all there. If you want to do more than your state, go ahead. But we need their phones to start ringing off the hook about this one issue. Mark my words, they're already starting to notice the media coverage, right? They're seeing what made Ben Fordham make that Facebook post last night. They saw that they noticed that 7:30 is covering this and it covers them all. They would have seen, someone would have brought to their attention the Sydney Morning Herald. They can hear the drums beating. Now's the time to melt their phones down. You can actually do something. And if you've been regular viewers of this channel for the last 4 or 5 years, you will see that this has been a very, very effective process. You pick the right target, you zero in on it, and then it's all the forces you can muster. Boom, right? When we did it with the Australia Post campaign, we unleashed the calls, and I think 2 or 3 days later, one of the secretary of the department called up one of the people involved on our side of the campaign and said, "Call off your dogs." But it was those dogs that forced them to call an inquiry, right? And this is what we need now. So the details are there. You got to call up and say, this is Joe Blogs or Josephine Blogs. Tell the senator he or she must support the call for a Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee inquiry into the regional banking crisis, right? Deliver that message to every member of Parliament, every senator in the next 2 weeks, and it'll really soften them up so that we can actually pull this off in that first sitting week of Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've done it before, and there are a few people a bit cynical about all of this, but believe me, I know it works. Politicians get the message eventually, and they do make different decisions. But of course,
I want to draw an analogy. So think about the old Nazi war camp or prison escape movie, and there's a searchlight that sweeps around. Right, and the people trying to escape, they know they don't want to get in that searchlight, so they wait until the searchlight moves on, and then they take off again, right? And they run for their life. These inquiries that we're calling, and we've got a bunch of them up, that is bringing that searchlight back again.
Yep.
Right, we need to. If we were in government, we could just flood the joint with 100% light all the time. We're not in the power of government. What we can do is organise these searchlights and make or as Craig Ishwood says, remove the fridge and watch the cockroach scurry, right? Yeah. Cockroaches scurry. It's the same kind of idea. So, because I understand people being cynical about the inquiries, just another inquiry. No, they're not just another inquiry. It's cumulative effect, and it's really worth doing.
Yeah, and it is real democracy in action. That's the point, isn't it? And it's based off a set of principles about the way that society should work and the way that the banking system should work. So that's why I've gone through some of this evening, because it isn't just about, saving cash or saving a few branches. There is a philosophical substructure to this, which is really important for people to understand, right? Because, and it can make a huge difference. So folks, please go across to that website, get the information and make those calls. And obviously, Robbie, we're going to continue to update people as we go forward over the next few weeks with all of these various campaign elements. And I will just make one other quick point. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Earlier on, there was Jason posted a question about universal service obligation. I'll just say that the universal service obligation for the banks is extremely opaque at the moment, right? And that's something else that we're pushing for as part of this, to have greater clarity about what it is that the bank should do. They've got this sort of charter of honesty, but actually, if you look at it, it's pretty flaky. And there is really no specific service obligation to the banks in Australia, and that's a problem too.
The wording is great in their charter. What do they call it? The Banking Code of Conduct. The wording is great, but it's also worded with a view to with knowing that there's no one there to enforce it. Just like the banks aren't afraid of ASIC, the banks aren't afraid of APRA, and the banks aren't afraid of the government to enforce this. Penny Wong was on one of these. There's been 2 inquiries in the past. In the 1999 one, Alba was on it. 2004 one, Penny Wong was on it. And Penny Wong wrote the dissenting report for that one. And she wrote, if the banks keep closing branches, we, Labor, would re-regulate them.
Yep.
Well, since then, Labor's now been back in government twice.
Yep.
Right? They didn't re-regulate 2008 to 2013. Well, will they re-regulate now? But see, for them, it's all talk. And the banks act like entities that are not afraid of anyone in the government. We need them to be afraid of the power of government, right? The power of government, screws up your life all the time. I love Jared Rennick's polemic, get government out of the bedroom and get it back into providing services, right? The government uses its reach whenever it wants to. But with the banks, it's hands off. They're the only business in which the customer is not always right. They're right. The customer can go take a long jump off a short pier as far as the bank's concerned because they know they've got, where they're going to go, right? They're a cartel. So that's the first. We've got to change that dynamic. You want the banks to go to almost be at war with the government because they know this government, the government is hell bent on making them do the right thing.
Absolutely. Well, the right thing, of course, depends on your perspective. But if you start from the idea that people need banks, businesses need banks, there are basic services that need to be there. There's a flow of investment coming from the banks to enable real things to happen in the real economy. That's a good starting point. And unfortunately, that's not what we got today. I will just tell you in the poll, so we ran a poll, the questions was the continued right to use cash if we want to. One should be safeguarded in law. 92% of those who voted said that. 2% said it was irrelevant because digital has replaced it. 1% said it's merely a nice to have, cash. And 5% said no issue, I never use cash now. So there's an overwhelming level of support for an understanding that this is a really critical issue and that the right to use cash should be protected at law. So there you go.
Good, and we are looking at the options for how you would do that. The law doesn't require it yet, but only because the laws we use were written at a time when the idea of not taking cash was unthinkable.
Yeah.
So this is a period where society is in flux, grappling with these new technological changes. Some of that's quite natural and understandable, and there's going to be mistakes made. That's why we have to be very, very forceful now in applaud good technology when it comes along, but insist that the basics always work.
Absolutely. Well, Robbie, I want to say thank you very much for your time tonight, and just give you the Citizens URL once again.
Yeah, it's just citizensparty.org.au. So we have a media releases section on the front page there. The latest one today with a picture of an ATM is the one to click on, and you'll see instructions for the calling senators. And there's a link down the bottom where all the senators' details, emails and phone numbers are right in front of you. That's what you need to use.
Excellent, thanks. Well, thanks, Robbie. Appreciate your time tonight. Very important messages. We'll keep everybody updated, and we'll keep fighting.
Good. Thanks, Martin. Thanks to the audience.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to take you offline, and I'm going to close the show. See you, Robbie. Cheers.
Yep.
So there you go. Very important conversation, and some very important messages there, I think, too. Just to say that next week, Damien Classen's coming on. We're going to talk about the markets and what's going on. Have the markets turned? Is there a more bullish phase, or are we still looking for earnings deficits? So that will be the conversation next Tuesday. And of course, as normal, there will be other shows during the week on various matters. A lot of stuff going on at the moment. So thank you very much for sharing some of your evening with us. I hope you found that a useful conversation. And please like the post, share it, and make sure everybody understands why this is a really important issue. So thank you very much. We'll see you next week, and hopefully see you off via the recorded shows. In the meantime, this is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.